A childhood friend recommended Hairbrained Scheme's video game Battletech to me because he felt it was the truest representation of the tabletop game we had played as kids. So I bought the game, and he was right. This game was pure nostalgia, enhanced with amazing art direction and tense strategic gameplay. In the Battletech universe, a galactic equivalent of the Geneva Conventions has banned weapons of mass destruction, leaving governments with armed forces like infantry, tanks, dropships, and most importantly, giant robots of varying weight classes called mechs. In the game, you lead a lance of mechs into different battle scenarios loaded with lasers, missiles, and other abilities that they will use to bash each other to pieces, chink by chink. Even though I played Battletech as a youth, I didn't remember the rules much at all. I played this new video game based on what I thought was most intuitive, but my intuition was very wrong, and I quickly got my mech warriors in a bad place. So I went to YouTube for guides, and these were helpful, but there was also a lot of contradictory advice. While the Battletech player tutorials were perfectly fine, there was a lot more in the game than could be absorbed in a tutorial, and the GUI was informationally dense. There's a lot of data on the screen, and I didn't know how to process it all. For example, the game had an evasion mechanic, where the further you move, the harder it is for opponents to hit your mech, but I didn't know much more about the details of how it worked beyond that. There was the heat mechanic, where if you push your mech too far, firing too many weapons or running too far, it will overheat, suffering damage or shutting down completely. There was a knockdown mechanic, where mechs topple over and lay prone and are especially vulnerable to attacks. All of these game mechanics added depth to the strategic turn-based play that were going completely over my head. Lucky for me, I had comprehensive rulebooks for the game sitting in my library, so I broke them out and started refreshing my memory. In the myriad tables within these books, I found that movement increases evasion, where the further you move, the harder you are to hit. And I found that if the attacker walks or runs, they make it harder to hit their targets. I learned about different mech builds and the various weapons they come equipped with. I learned that I was having trouble hitting mechs with some of my big guns because those guns, like the Particle Projection Cannon, or PPC, have a minimum range and a more difficult time hitting targets that are too close to them. I was so excited about learning all these game mechanics that I printed out some mech tracking sheets, grabbed my Heroescape tiles, pulled out some old Mech Warrior miniatures, and recruited my boys into a game to relive my junior high years. It did not go well. First came the tabletop game's algorithm for hitting opposing mechs with your weapons. This is encompassed in the acronym GATOR. Gunnery skill plus attacker movement plus target movement plus other factors plus range to the target. So let's go through the algorithm for hitting an enemy mech and dealing damage to it. The gunnery skill is how good your mech warrior is at hitting the things they shoot at. Then there's attacker movement. This is how far your mech moved during this turn. Then we have target movement, which is how far the target moved during the turn. Then there's other factors, like terrain. Are there trees or other obstacles between the attacker and their target? And finally, there's range. Different weapons have varying short, medium, and long ranges, and some weapons even have minimum ranges where they get penalties if the target is too close. So let's see how this plays out in an average turn. Here's my 8-year-old lining up a shot on my mech. They have a base gunnery skill of 4, plus 1 for them walking this turn, plus 2 for my mech moving 5 to 6 hexes, plus 1 for the light forest between us, and plus 2 for me being 6 hexes away. That means having to roll a 10 or greater to hit. With a 12-sided die, that would be a 1 in 4 chance, which isn't great. But it's actually worse than that because Battletech doesn't use a 12-sided die. It uses 2 6-sided dice, which means there isn't an even distribution of outcomes for each dice roll. You can't roll a 1 with 2 dice, and there's only a 1 in 36 chance of rolling a 12. You have slightly less than 1 in 3 chance of rolling 9 or better, and only a 1 in 6 chance of rolling 10 or better. This means that you are going to make a lot of dice rolls trying to hit your opponent's mechs. A lot of dice rolls. But wait, there's more. When you do finally make a hit, you then check the mech hit location table and roll 2 6-sided dice to see where on your opponent the hit landed. That's now 6 tables we've had to check in this algorithm, and there are more when you factor in missiles, heat, and piloting checks. So when my 8-year-old finally scored the first hit of the game and got to see the damage assigned to my mech, his excitement quickly turned to despair seeing only these 5 little dots marked off on my left torso. Oh, And that's just the external armor. Once you get through that, you still have internal structures you have to destroy. So I don't blame my son when he exclaimed, "Ah! This is going to take all day! I'm not playing this anymore!" Originally, when I was thinking about this video, I thought it would be about how we can use rulebooks from tabletop games like Battletech, Dungeons & Dragons, or the Pathfinder role-playing game to understand the algorithms informing their digital counterparts. But the 30-year-old tabletop game I remember enjoying was a much different experience from the video game I was now enjoying. As a youth, I loved reading the Star Trek movie novelizations before seeing the movie just to see how my imagination compared with what was on the screen. An entire generation of kids got to experience this with the Harry Potter novels and the films that followed them. A fun exercise for English classes is to ask, how is the movie different from the book? So we can also ask, how does the video game compare to its source material? A September 2017 article in PC Games touches on the differences between the tabletop and video game versions of Battletech. Quoting the article here, "In bringing the game to PC, Wiseman's team has deepened the relationship between the systems of heat, stability, and armor. When you get yourself too hot, you're actually physically wounding the mech, not just providing modifiers like it did in the tabletop, but actually wounding the mech itself," he says. "The most recent update added flamethrowers to the game, so now you can overheat any mechs to shut them down and cause massive internal damage. The stability system means that as mechs take hits, they become unstable, and if they become too unstable, fall over. A down mech is particularly vulnerable, and one of the few times you can call a shot on a specific mech body part. The system encourages risky moves, like getting a mech up close and personal for melee attack, which it can knock a mech down better than any gunshot." Tabletop Battletech is a game of managing probabilities and taking calculated risks. Here's a table of weapons on a mech. 4 weapons means 4 dice rolls and 4 chances to hit. The autocannon 10s are better at closer ranges, with the LRM, long-range missile, and PPC better at longer ranges. Each weapon generates heat. As heat builds up in your mech, it begins to suffer performance issues. It starts to move more slowly, and hitting targets becomes more difficult. Ammunition in the mech might explode, and eventually the mech will even shut down. As you can see in this table of effects, heat adds another layer of complexity to the game's algorithms. Weapons have trade-offs in terms of heat and damage. Firing a weapon now may mean not firing it later or taking detrimental effects in order to keep firing. The PPC deals 10 damage but generates 10 heat, while the autocannon deals 10 damage generating only 3 heat each. However, the autocannons have ammunition which can run out or explode if your opponent gets a lucky hit. In contrast, Hairbrained Schemes Battletech simply has a heat bar. When your mech has generated a certain level of heat, it will suffer damage. When your mech generates too much heat, it shuts down completely, making it highly vulnerable to attack. These simple mechanics are appropriate for the video game setting because I don't know how you would communicate to the player that they are now suffering a +2 modifier to their hit probabilities, a -4 to their movement speed, and a 25% to 90% chance of shutdown. It makes sense to keep it simple. Too much heat and you will definitely take damage or definitely shut down. While Tabletop Battletech adds strategic depth and complexity to play using heat, the video game adds a depth and complexity with its called shot mechanic. There are times when a mech is disabled or your pilot is inspired, where they can target a specific location on the enemy mech. In this situation, both the mech's left and right torsos are heavily damaged, and I can probably blow one off with a good shot. The enemy mech's right torso has 2 medium lasers and short-range missile ammunition, while the left torso has long-range missiles, short-range missiles, and ammunition. If I can take out the left torso, I can eliminate these weapons. I could also shoot for the leg and make the mech fall down. Hovering over these different locations, I find I have a 90% chance of hitting either of the torsos because the mech is facing me head-on. If it was turned to the right or left away from me, I would have a much lower chance of hitting those locations. I take the shot, blow off the left torso, and knock down the enemy mech. With 2 of its most dangerous weapons eliminated, I can ignore it to focus on bigger, more immediate threats. Tabletop only allows called shots when the target mech is knocked down or shut down. Allowing it more often would shorten games down to which player could blow off their opponent's key locations fastest. A skirmish that is meant to take hours could finish in minutes. In a video game, where players are expected to battle through dozens of skirmishes over the course of a campaign, it makes sense to streamline play against the AI in a way that empowers player agency. Players can take out weapon systems to quickly eliminate threats, take out legs to cripple mechs, or go for low probability headshots to maximize the salvage recovered. Tabletop Battletech has a fall mechanic, where your mech warrior must make a piloting skill check to see if their mech topples over. Certain critical hits, types of damage, too much damage, types of movement, terrain, and many other factors can require this check. After a mech falls, you then have additional tables to see what direction your mech falls, where it takes damage from the fall, and how much damage it takes based on the mech's tonnage. Called shots are allowed on a prone mech, so melee attacks and concentrating fire on a mech to force piloting checks is an important strategy. The video game has streamlined stability so that each mech has a stability bar, just below the heat bar, keeping track of how unstable it is during combat. In this screenshot, you can see Glitch piloting my Battlemaster has taken 2 bars of instability from hits, 3 more and she'll get knocked down. Each weapon that hits a mech increases its instability, with some weapons like the PPC++ making the target mech more unstable than others. When the bar is maxed out, the mech falls down. Like heat, it's very straightforward and it can make sense to concentrate your fire on a single mech to knock it down and lose its turn. The video game also, on the surface of things, presents hit difficulties in a more straightforward manner with evasion tokens. These arrows beside the mech represent its evasion level. The more arrows, the more evasion. Just like in Tabletop, the further a mech moves, the harder it is to hit, with bonus evasion when the mech makes a jump, making it easier to hit. I love how this adds even more strategy to combat, as you might have your weaker mechs fire on an enemy first to strip the evasion tokens and then follow up with your heavy mechs, having improved chances to hit. Implementing this mechanic in Tabletop would be awesome, but it would also mean adding yet another variable to track and add to the Gator algorithm. It would also ruin the algorithm's wonderful mnemonic. A key feature of both Tabletop and digital Battletech is allowing players to customize their mechs. The video game allows you to adjust armor levels, heat sinks, and upgrade parts so long as your mech doesn't carry more than its weight, class, or tonnage. It also allows you to swap out weapons within constraints, the constraints being that the mech you are modifying needs to have mount points for those weapons. Some mechs can't carry missiles, while others can't carry autocannons or PPCs. In contrast, so long as you keep within your tonnage, Tabletop grants you complete creativity in building your mech. You can build from scratch and bring completely custom configurations to the table. With so much freedom to customize your mech comes a great deal of mental overhead. I remember customizing mechs as a kid, and there was a lot of math figuring out how to get the right balance of weapons, heat sinks, and armor. Today, there are several online tools that can do all the math for you. And I think that's the core difference between Tabletop and digital versions of this game. In the digital medium, we have a computer doing all the hard calculations for us, and Hairbrained Schemes Battletech takes full advantage of that to streamline play while keeping it deep. For example, they implement environmental variables. There are Arctic worlds where your mech won't overheat as easily. There are high and low gravity planets that affect how far your mechs can jump. There are water worlds where your mechs can reduce their heat while standing in water. And there are dusty Martian worlds where the thin atmosphere makes it hard to vent heat. Tabletop Battletech lets you play in hot and cold environments too if you want. Environmental variables, along with mechanics like standing in water, stability, and mech knockdowns are intermediate level mechanics that add more strategy to play. They also add more and more reference tables, and therefore more cognitive overhead to our game. An exhaustive August 2009 post on BoardGameGeek by Ethan Van Voorst really captured how it feels to track all of these variables on paper. He writes, "In Battletech, you have to check off little boxes on a record sheet for each individual unit to track damage. First, you apply damage to armor, and once all the armor boxes are checked off, you have to start marking off the internal hits. And if you're lucky and get a critical hit, you then have to refer to a special table to see what that does, and then possibly annotate the record sheet with whatever special damage gets inflicted, left arm actuator inoperative, heat sink destroyed, etc. The whole tedious process is more akin to science fiction accounting than it is to battle mech piloting." I love that term, science fiction accounting, and he calls it tedious, but science fiction accounting can be a lot of fun. Science fiction accounting is imaginary play with rules. It's constrained creativity. Tabletop games express themselves through game mechanics, and the more algorithms, the more detailed the world. When I was a kid, computers were too slow to captivate our minds the way they do now, and video games were often very abstract and involved as much science fiction accounting as board games in many cases. I appreciate those long Saturdays we spent at the table immersing ourselves in these deep, complex algorithms describing a world and how it works. I also appreciate Hairbrained Schemes Battletech for letting me relive those days with a game that's so good it made me forget what a dinosaur Tabletop Battletech is in the modern tabletop gaming space. They have made a fantastic game by taking the core game and all the stuff that was too complicated for practical tabletop play, and then let the players sit back and enjoy the experience of directing their mechs while the computer takes care of all the algorithms. And we can still enjoy deep, cognitively challenging tabletop games. I still enjoy and appreciate Tabletop Battletech, but it's almost 40 years old now, and tabletop gaming has advanced dramatically over the decades. Today's best board games scale back the randomness in favor of crafting crunchy, satisfying puzzles that are an absolute joy to play. When I started this video, I thought it was going to be about how we could see inside the black box of a video game to understand its algorithms, and we've accomplished that by exploring the differences between the tabletop and digital versions of this game. Tabletop ambitiously uses endless algorithms to describe a fully realized world. It's successful at this, but only if you mentally commit all of these algorithms to memory and practice them through execution until they become automatic. The persistent success of Battletech proves that's possible, but it's a level of commitment most of today's players aren't ready to make. Digital Battletech also uses endless algorithms to describe a world that's almost identical to tabletop and goes beyond it, but those algorithms are abstracted behind an interface where the player doesn't need to worry about them. But knowing they exist and how they affect our gameplay enhance our play and make the game more strategic. This has been a fun and enlightening exercise. In my backlog of video games to play, I have Dungeons & Dragons as well as Pathfinder role-playing games to tackle. Like Battletech, these are both based on tabletop games and are supposed to implement the rules of D&D and Pathfinder. It will be fun once again to see how these digital games compare to their tabletop counterparts. I hope you've enjoyed this video as much as I've enjoyed making it. Until next time, thank you for watching.